She was a librarian. He was the most dangerous man in Chicago, and neither of them knew that a dead man had planned their meeting 20 years in advance. Let's see. Mincy. When Nora Voss found a map in a donation box on a Tuesday night, she thought it was a coincidence. It was not. Her father had been one of the most careful men alive. And careful men do not leave things behind by accident. That map was a message, a key, and it led her directly to Callum Reyes, a man with no criminal record, no digital footprint, and no public presence, a man who had spent 11 years knowing everything about everyone in this city without anyone knowing anything about him. But here is what nobody talks about. When mass people put their hands on Nora, left a bruise on her face and a split lip on a cold November night, the most powerful information broker in Chicago went completely still. Not loud, not theatrical, cold. And what he did next did not involve a single gunshot. It involved 20 years of evidence released simultaneously to a reporter, a federal prosecutor, and 17 major donors, all at once, no warning, no way to take it back. The city went silent, because nobody expected that. This channel is about people who were born to lead. There are lessons that no school, no book, and no mentor will ever teach you. Only the ones who have actually held power understand them. We do not tell crime stories here. We tell stories about mindset, about discipline, and about the real secrets behind genuine power. Today's story is about what it means to protect someone without being asked, about what it costs to be the kind of person who does the right thing precisely when it is most expensive, and about a father who trusted his daughter with the most important thing he ever built, not because she was ready, but because he believed she would be. If that is the kind of story that stays with you, you are in the right place. Hit subscribe. Drop a comment telling me what you think real power actually looks like. And share this with one person who needs to hear it today.
Nora Voss had memorized the location of 34,000 documents. Not one of them told her why her father had to die. She worked alone on Tuesday nights by choice. The Hargrove Institute closed at 9, but the building never really emptied until 10. And in that quiet hour between closing and lockup, the basement archive became the closest thing to peace she had left. No questions. No faces looking at her with that particular expression people wear around grief they don't know how to address. Just the hum of the fluorescent light overhead, the smell of old paper and wood, and the work. Tonight the work was a donation box. A building in Bridgeport had been demolished 3 weeks ago. The owners left behind the contents of their storage unit, the way people leave behind what they no longer want to carry. Nora's job was to decide what was worth keeping. She moved through the box efficiently. Architectural drawings from the 1940s, a stack of business correspondence, 3 folders of city ordinance paperwork from 1962. She logged each item, assigned it a preliminary catalog number, set it in the appropriate sorting pile. Near the bottom of the box, she found a photograph album, black and white, the kind with thick black paper pages. She opened it and looked at a photograph of a small child, maybe 4 years old, standing in front of a Christmas tree and laughing at something off camera. She did not know this child. She would never know this child. But someone had loved this photograph enough to keep it for 70 years. She placed the album carefully in a separate preservation sleeve, handled it the way you handle something that still matters to someone somewhere, even if that someone is gone. Then she reached the last item in the box, a map. She started to set it on the standard pile. Her hand stopped. The paper was pale yellow, nearly the color of old cream. The ink was dark brown, applied with a particular weight, a particular angle she recognized before her brain had consciously processed why. The way her father held a pen when drawing curves, slightly tilted, uneven pressure on the downstrokes, a physical signature as distinctive as a voice. She had seen a map like this exactly once before, the night before her father died, on the desk in his apartment. She had not paid close attention. She had not known she needed to. When she came back after the funeral, the apartment had been searched. Every map Edmund Voss had drawn in the last 20 years was gone. The police report said the value of the missing property was undetermined. The file was closed 72 hours after his death. A mugging, a random mugging. Nothing unusual about a 58-year-old man walking home from the train station on a Wednesday evening in November. The watch was still on his wrist. His Omega, the one he had worn since his wedding day. Muggers take watches. Nora folded the map carefully, placed it inside her coat pocket, continued processing the donation box as if nothing had happened. This was what she had learned in 8 months of being careful. You do not react in the open. You do not let your face tell the story. You evaluate, you decide, and then you act when the moment is right. Her father had taught her that without knowing he was teaching it. She had simply grown up watching a man who noticed everything and said only what was necessary. Dennis came by at 8:45 with a pizza box and the easy energy of someone whose life was not complicated by dead fathers and missing maps. Dennis said, "Hey, we are all ordering. Do you want anything?" Nora said, "No thanks." Dennis said, "You sure? You look like you have not eaten since this morning." Nora said, "I ate. I just look like this." Dennis laughed. He had a good laugh, Dennis, easy and genuine. Nora watched him walk away and felt something she did not have a name for. Not envy exactly, more like recognition of a distance. He existed in a world where a Tuesday night meant pizza and colleagues and nothing more complicated than choosing toppings. She had lived in that world once. She could not locate the door back to it. She returned to work. At 7:05, she carried a retrieval box from the sorting room to the main reading area. The reading room had 12 tables, good lighting, and a small reference desk near the door where Phil sat during the day. Phil was 67 and had worked at Hargrove for 15 years and operated by a set of instincts so refined they had become invisible even to himself. There was a man at the corner table she had not seen before. Dark blue wool sweater, reading glasses, a notebook open in front of him, a pen in his hand. He looked like a professor. He had positioned himself with his back to the wall and his eyeline on the door. He had no phone on the table, no laptop, no bag. In 2024, a person in a research institution with no electronic device of any kind was making a deliberate choice. She noted this the way she noted everything, filed it, continued to the shelving unit on the far side of the room. As she passed his table, without looking up from his notebook, the man said, "Box 7C has been reshelved out of sequence, third shelf from the left. Someone moved the 1940 through 1943 sections behind the 1951 through 1955. In case that matters." Nora stopped. She looked at shelf 7C. He was correct, down to the specific decade subdivision. She had not checked that shelf in 4 days. The reshelving had happened sometime this week. To notice the error, someone would have had to remember the original organization and then identify the deviation. That was not something a casual visitor to an archive did. She said, "How do you know that?" He looked up for the first time. His eyes were the color of amber, alert in a way that had nothing to do with caffeine. He was looking at her the way a person looks at a map, identifying coordinates before committing to a route. He said, "I notice things that are out of place. It is a habit." She held his gaze for 2 seconds, registered the economy of the answer. No surplus words, no social padding. Then she continued to the shelf, retrieved her box, and returned to her station. She did not open the box immediately. She sat with her hand resting on the lid and thought about a man who notices things that are out of place, sitting in an archive without requesting a single document for going on 4 hours now, and about the map in her coat pocket, and about the fact that in all 34,000 records she had cataloged in this building, she had no file on anyone matching that description. At 8:58, She walked the room to close up. He was still there. Notebook closed, pen put away. He had been looking toward the door before she entered the room. She said, "We closed at 9." He said, "It is 8:58." She said, "You have been here for 4 hours, and you have not requested a single document." He did not answer the question she had asked. He said, "Sometimes you come to a place just to remember what it used to hold." She looked at him steadily. Not curiosity of the kind that involves wanting something in return. The curiosity of someone who organizes information for a living. She said, "You knew Edmund Voss." Not a question. He stood, put on his coat with unhurried, economical movements, walked toward the door. Phil was already moving to open it before the man had raised his hand. At the threshold, he paused. He did not turn around. He said, "Your father was a very careful man, Miss Voss. It is a quality worth inheriting." He left. Nora stood in the empty reading room. Her hand was in her coat pocket. Her fingers rested on the folded map. He knew her name. He knew her father. There was no file on him anywhere in this building. She thought, that is either an accident or a warning. And she had stopped believing in accidents 8 months ago. She slept 3 hours, not from insomnia. 3 hours was simply the amount she could afford. By 5:30 in the morning, the map was spread across her kitchen table, and she was already working through it. Her coffee had gone cold. She had not noticed. Her father built the coding system for her when she was 9 years old. He called it their secret language. Every bedtime story had a puzzle inside it. A mountain in the story was a person with power. A river was money moving between people. Coordinates embedded in the narrative encoded dates in a format she had memorized without knowing she was memorizing it. She thought it was a game. He thought it was preparation. She understood now that he had known, somewhere in the back of his meticulous mind, that she might need it. The map showed a network, not geography. People. 3 primary nodes at the top of the structure. She recognized 2 of them. A name from her father's past she had heard mentioned once, and one she wished she did not recognize at all. Senator Harlan Mast. She had seen him on television last Thursday, standing at a podium in front of an Illinois state flag, talking about government transparency, running for governor, the kind of man who had mastered the art of looking clean. Her phone rang at 6:17. Unknown number. She did not answer. It rang again. Then a third time. The third call told her something. A person who calls 3 times without leaving a voicemail knows you are there. They are telling you they will wait. She answered. The voice said, "I need to see the map, Miss Voss. Not to take it. To explain it." She recognized it from the reading room. She said, "How do you have this number?" He said, "The same way I know you found it last night. The same way I know you have not slept." She looked at her window. The curtains were drawn. She sat still and counted 8 slow breaths and ran the calculation. What she knew, what she did not know, what she stood to gain or lose from the 2 possible answers to the question of whether this man was dangerous. She said, "Where?" He gave her an address. A diner in Pilsen, 30 minutes. The diner was small and warm and smelled of coffee and frying butter. He was already there, seated at the corner table with his back to the wall and a clear sight line to the door. He had ordered 2 coffees. He had not asked what she wanted. She noted that he had ordered correctly. Extra cream, no sugar, strong, not a guess. Either he had asked someone who knew her or he had done his research. She did not comment on it. When she walked in, he registered immediately that she had not brought the map. He gave a small nod. The nod of someone recognizing a correct decision. He waited until she sat. Then he said, "Your father worked for me." Not officially. Not on paper. She let the sentence exist in the space between them without reacting to it. She had learned that her immediate reaction was information, and she did not want to give him information she had not decided to give. He said, "Edmund was a cartographer in every complete sense of that word. He mapped things that could not be mapped openly. Relationships between people with power, financial movements, Political leverage. For 20 years, he documented what I needed to know, but could not gather myself without becoming visible. He was meticulous. He was careful. He was the best at what he did. She said, "Why are you telling me this?" He said, "Because someone found out what he was doing, and I do not know who." She said, "And the map." He said, "Is either bait, or it is something your father needed someone to find." "I have to know which one," she said. "And you think I can tell you?" He said, "I think you already know. I think you have known since last night." She looked at her coffee. She thought about her father at 9 years old teaching her their secret language in the dark of her bedroom, spinning stories about mountains and rivers that were really about something else entirely. She thought about all the things he had given her without telling her why. She said, "He coded his maps in a system he designed for me when I was 9. Bedtime stories with hidden coordinates. It was the first true thing she gave him. Not because she trusted him, because she was not going to understand what her father had done unless she moved forward, and this was the only door available." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I know. He told me about it once. He called it your language." She looked up at that. He said, "Your father and I worked together for 15 years. He came to me after my brother disappeared. He was the only person outside my organization who knew to come to me." Before she could ask about the brother, she caught movement outside the window. A man in a gray parka across the street, standing without purpose. She had seen him an hour ago, 2 blocks from the institute. She said, "The man across the street in the gray parka. Is he yours?" He did not turn his head. He said, "No." She said, "Then we have about 4 minutes before this conversation changes category." He stood, set money on the table without counting it, spoke quietly. "Back door, left down the alley, right on 19th Street, green door, go in and go up." She said, "I do not know you." He paused. He looked at her directly and said, "No, but you knew your father, and he trusted me." She held that for one beat, then she stood up. The room above the diner was plain. 1 table, 2 chairs, a window that let in thin morning light. A place designed for conversations that needed to happen without witnesses. She said, "What happened to the man outside?" He said, "He is spending the next 2 hours explaining himself to someone who asks better questions than either of us." She noted the answer. No violence implied. A process. Proportionate. She said, "I want to find out who killed my father." He said, "I know," she said, "and you want the map." He said, "I want to understand what he was trying to say when he made sure it survived." She looked at her hands. Her father's hands were longer than hers. He used to say she had cartographer's hands, shorter fingers, better for drafting long lines without fatigue. She had never understood what he meant until now. She said, "Then we want the same thing." She did not trust him. She trusted one specific thing. Her father was the most careful man she had ever known, and her father had trusted this man. That was not sentiment. That was an indirect evidence chain she could work with. His name was Callum Reyes. She would test everything else as she went. His office was on the 14th floor of an ordinary building in the West Loop. No name on the door, no receptionist, no sign of anything. What was inside was not what she expected. She had prepared herself for something performative, something designed to communicate power to visitors. What she found instead was a room where someone genuinely worked. A wide desk with reading light optimized for documents. Filing cabinets in dark steel, locked with combination mechanisms. A work table to the left with a good lamp and a lighted magnifier for detail work. And along the full length of one wall, maps. Chicago in 1871, the year of the fire. Chicago in 1920, Prohibition era. Chicago in 1968. Chicago in 2010. Between them, interspersed without announcement, were smaller maps. Hand-drawn, pale yellow paper, dark brown ink. She crossed to the wall before she had consciously decided to move. She said, "That is my father's work." Callum said, 12 years of it. He updated the series every quarter. She placed her fingertips at the corner of the nearest one, feeling the paper, the grain of it, the faint ridge of dried ink along each line. Her father used to let her touch his work when she was small. He said you can learn more from touching a map than from reading it. Paper remembers pressure. She said, "He never showed me these." Callum said, "He was protecting you." She said, "From what?" He said, "From knowing what he knew." You cannot know what he knew and stay safe at the same time. He made a choice. She stood with her fingers resting on the paper for a moment longer. Then she stepped back, sat down at the work table, and took out the map from her coat. She spread it flat. He came to stand on the opposite side. She said, "The encoding system uses geographic symbols as substitutes. Mountains represent people with concentrated power. Rivers are financial flows. The GPS coordinate strings embedded in the margin notes are dates, formatted in degrees, minutes, seconds. But the numbers do not correspond to real locations. They correspond to a calendar. He and I built the conversion key together when I was 9. He told me it was a game." Callum listened without interrupting. He did not ask questions she had not finished answering. He followed quickly, which meant he was not learning the system so much as recognizing the logic of it. She began decoding the first cluster, a mountain labeled with a sequence that translated to the name Harlan Mast. River channels flowing from it to nodes she had not yet decoded, dates spanning 18 years. She said, "Give me context on this node here, the one marked with the cross ridge symbol." He went to the third filing cabinet from the left, did not check labels, opened the drawer, counted 6 folders in, pulled out the 6th, opened it to what turned out to be page 4. Set it on the table in front of her. She looked at the file. Then she looked at the cabinet. Then she looked at him. She said, "You organize by the same system he used." He said without looking up, "He taught me." She did not say anything to that. But something shifted in how she was reading him. Not trust exactly. Recognition. This man had known her father well enough to absorb how he thought. That was not a superficial relationship. They worked for 2 hours without stopping. She decoded. He provided context. She spoke precisely, and he listened precisely, and they moved faster together than either of them would have moved alone. The map was dense. 20 years of her father's meticulous documentation compressed into a single sheet in a system no one else could read. The shape of it became clear gradually, the way a landscape emerges from fog when you are moving toward it. Edmund Voss had not just mapped relationships, he had mapped evidence. Every transaction cross-referenced from at least 2 independent sources. Every meeting confirmed by physical location data and financial records. 20 years of documentation that would be, in the hands of the right person, enough to collapse not one individual, but an entire structure of power that had been running parallel to Chicago's legitimate government for nearly 2 decades. But the map itself was not the evidence. It was a key. She said, "The actual documentation is not here." Callum said, "I had the same thought 10 minutes ago." She said, "He built a library. This is the catalog. The actual holdings are somewhere else." Callum looked at the map for a long moment. He said, "Your father didn't build a library, Nora. He built a bomb." He said it quietly, the way people say things that cost something. She looked at him across the table. She said, "And he left the detonator to me." The room was very still. She said, "Did you know what he was building?" Callum did not answer immediately. He took time with the question, which told her he was going to answer it honestly. He said, "I knew he was documenting. I did not know the scope. If I had known—" He stopped. She said, "You would have stopped him." He said, "I would have been more careful with him." That sentence was not strategy. That was a man living inside something that had not happened, the care he should have taken and had not. She recognized that grammar intimately. She had been speaking it for 8 months. She did not offer him absolution. She did not know yet whether it was hers to give. She said, There are more locations on the map. 7 nodes I have not decoded. I will need 2 more sessions. He said, "Take the time you need." She put on her coat, picked up the map. At the door she stopped and did not turn around. She said, "He was right about the filing system. Yours is better organized than mine." She left before he could answer. She did not think about what she had said until she was 3 blocks away, walking into the November wind. In 11 years of working alone, she was fairly sure that was the first compliment Callum Reyes had not seen coming. She filed the observation under things worth remembering. She brought sandwiches the next morning, Polish Bakery, 2 blocks from the Institute, smoked turkey on dark rye with pickles and mustard. She bought 2 without thinking about it, which meant she had been thinking about it. She set one in front of him without explanation and sat down and opened hers. He said, "You did not have to do that." She said, "I know." He ate the way she had begun to expect him to eat everything, with full attention, unhurried, not checking the time or reaching for a file. The sandwich mattered for the duration of the sandwich. Then the work would matter. He did not divide his attention. They worked in parallel silence for the first hour. She decoded, he cross-referenced. No music, no background conversation, no instinct to fill the quiet with noise. It was the kind of silence that takes time to find with another person, the kind where the absence of sound feels like agreement rather than discomfort. She noticed his notebook. Every page carried a list of questions, each question crossed out when resolved. Most pages had more questions open than closed. He was not a man who believed he had answers. He was a man who knew precisely where his knowledge stopped. That was more reassuring than confidence would have been. Jake called at 11:15. She watched his name appear on her screen for 1 second before answering. Her voice changed in a way she could not control. It went warmer, easier, lighter. A performance of normalcy she had been maintaining for 8 months without any indication of how much it cost. Jake wanted to come to Chicago that weekend, eat at the Polish restaurant on Belmont, the one their father had taken them to every Christmas since they were children. He sounded good. He sounded like himself. She said yes, absolutely, set the date, talked about the weekend for 4 minutes. When the call ended, she set the phone face down on the table and her expression returned to its default setting. Callum said without looking up, "He does not know, not a question." She said, "He is in his final year. He has a thesis to finish. He has a life that does not involve any of this." He said, "He is going to find out eventually." She said, "Eventually is not now." He looked up, not reading information, recognizing something. He said, "Your father did the same thing, kept everyone from knowing, carried it alone." She said, "Is that a warning or a comparison?" He said, "An observation. The Voss family has a pattern." She did not respond to that. She knew he was right. Knowing he was right did not make the pattern easier to break. She was working through the 3rd location cluster on the map when a name appeared that stopped her. Not Mast, not Webb. A different name. 1 word. Daniel. She said, "Who is Daniel?" The silence that followed lasted longer than any silence Callum had produced before. She counted 5 seconds before he spoke. He said, "My younger brother." She waited. He said, "Daniel worked in finance. He was smart in the way that involves seeing things other people miss in numbers. He was building a financial evidence case against people I had been watching for years. He did not tell me because he thought I would stop him." She said, "What happened to him?" He said, "He disappeared on a Thursday. They found his car near the river. There was no body." He delivered this the way a person delivers a fact they have had to recite often enough that it has lost its jagged edges. The grief was not gone. It had simply been worn smooth by repetition. She recognized the texture of it. She said, "That is why you started this." He said, "That is why I became very good at knowing things before they become problems." Yes. She looked at the map, at the symbol she had been about to decode. Her father's marking for Daniel was clear, now that she understood the system fully. It was the symbol he used for people who had been wronged, not perpetrators, victims. She said, "My father mapped what happened to your brother. It is here." Callum's hands were flat on the table and they did not move. He was holding himself very still. He said, "Show me." She could have remained on her side of the table and simply pointed. The map was large enough. She went around to his side instead. Not because it was necessary, because it was news about a brother, and news like that should not be read alone. She set the map between them and read it out to him in order. The financial trail Daniel had followed. The people he had been building a case against. The last documented entry in his father's record, dated 3 months after the disappearance, noting the closure of the river search with no further findings. When she finished, neither of them spoke. They stood side by side, not touching, looking at the map for about 30 seconds. The fluorescent lights hummed. Outside the window, 14 floors down, Chicago moved. Callum said, "Your father left a map for every person he lost. He was thorough." She said, "He loved people by documenting them. It was the only language he had." She had not planned to say that. It was simply true, and it came out before she could decide whether to say it. She was aware immediately that she had said something that was not only about her father, and she could feel that Callum was aware of the same thing. Neither of them named it. At the end of the day, she was putting on her coat, and he had rolled the map carefully for her to carry. He said, "Tomorrow afternoon? Same time?" She said, "I have work until noon." He said, "I will have food here." She said, "You do not have to do that." He said, "You brought sandwiches this morning." She said, "That was different." He said, "Was it?" She did not answer. She took the map, said goodnight, and left. On the elevator down, she thought, "I spent 10 hours in a room with the man who runs the information network of half this city's underworld. And what I keep thinking about is the way he said his brother's name. Like it is still present tense, like the loss has not finished happening." She understood that grammar down to the bone. She had been speaking it since November of last year. She pressed the lobby button and thought, "This is dangerous in a way that has nothing to do with Senator Mast." Someone had been in the archive overnight. Nothing taken, nothing visibly disturbed. But Nora had spent 4 years arranging this space with the same precision her father had used for his maps, and she knew immediately. The paper clip on the corner of Box 7C lay flat. She had left it at a 45-degree angle on Friday. A box on the third row had been replaced 2 inches to the left of its correct position. Someone had come in, searched carefully, and left without finding what they came for. She did not call the police. She called Callum. He arrived in 18 minutes, which meant he had been close or he had moved fast, and she suspected both. He came into her space the way she wanted people to treat her space. He did not touch anything that did not need touching. He looked before he used his hands. He asked her before opening any box he was not certain about. He moved through her archive the way she moved through it, like it was a place that deserved respect. He said, "3 people had building access last night. 2 are your colleagues. The third came in through the loading dock." She said, "How do you know about the loading dock?" He said, "The camera on that door has a 14-second blind spot every hour on the hour." Someone knew that. She said, "You have mapped my building." He said, "I map every building where people I am responsible for spend regular time." She said, "Am I someone you are responsible for?" He looked at her. Not strategically, not calculating. He said, "You are now." That afternoon they went to see Vera Mallory. Vera ran 4 dry cleaning shops across the North Side, genuinely successful, genuinely legitimate. She also happened to know more about the daily operational patterns of mid-level criminal activity in her part of the city than any single police precinct. She was 50 years old and had cultivated a reputation for discretion so reliable that people told her things they would not have told their own lawyers. The restaurant was on the 2nd floor of a building in River North. Vera was already at the table when they arrived. She had the composure of someone who was never surprised, and the eyes of someone who was always paying attention. She looked at Nora the way people look at someone they recognize from a photograph. She said, "Edmund's daughter." Nora said, "You knew my father." Vera said, "Everyone who mattered knew Edmund. He had a gift for being exactly where important things were happening, without anyone quite understanding how he got there." She paused, then turned to Callum. "The man you are looking for is not operating at a small level. He has been very quiet for a very long time, and he is not after the archive." She looked back at Nora. She said, "He is after her." Walking back through the West Loop in the November wind, Callum said there was something else, something she needed to know. She said, "Tell me." He said, "Your father did not leave the map in the archive accidentally. He arranged for that donation box to be processed at that facility, for that shift. Yours specifically. He set it up before he died." She stopped walking. She said, "He knew something was going to happen to him. He said he knew it was possible, he did not know when. So he built something in case he was right." She said, "He built me." He said, "He trusted you to find it, read it, understand what it meant, and know what to do next. He spent 28 years keeping you out of this world. The last decision he made was to trust you to be the one person who could navigate it." She stood on the sidewalk, wind off the lake, pushing against them both. A bus passed, a cab, the city continuing its indifferent business. What she heard in what he had just said was not only her father knew he might be in danger. What she heard was her father had seen her clearly, had known exactly who she was, had believed in her enough to put the most important thing he had ever done into her hands. She said, "He could have destroyed it, burned everything before it became a risk." Callum said, "Yes." She said, "He chose not to." He said, "He chose you." They stood together for a moment on the sidewalk. Then she looked at him and said, "Callum, when this is finished, what happens to you?" He was quiet for one long second. He said, "That is the first time you have used my name." She said, "Answer the question." He said, "I do not know yet." And it was true. She could hear that it was true. She nodded, started walking, did not look back, but she thought about the way he had said it. Not a deflection, not a prepared answer. An honest uncertainty from a man who had spent 11 years knowing everything about everyone. She was beginning to understand what it meant that she was the exception. They had a shared shorthand now. She said a name, he already had the folder. He described a location. She had already found the corresponding symbol on the map. They had decoded 5 of the 7 evidence locations in 3 working sessions. The process had become the way a well-maintained machine runs, without friction, without wasted motion. The 6th location was straightforward. The 7th took them longer. When they found it, they both went quiet at the same moment. Her father had hidden the 7th piece of evidence in Boston. She said, "That is where Jake goes to school." Callum said, "Yes." She said, "Jake does not know anything about any of this." He said, "No. But whoever is searching for this documentation will reach that same conclusion eventually. It is a logical extrapolation from what they already know about your father's life." The unasked question hung between them. She did not address it. Neither did he. Not yet. That evening, Callum ordered food from the Polish place 2 blocks away. Pierogi, soup, bread, real food, enough for 2 people, warm enough for a November night in Chicago. The map was folded and set aside for the first time in days. Nothing between them on the table except plates and 2 glasses of water. She asked him where he had learned to read maps. Not an interrogation. Genuine curiosity, the kind you feel towards someone you are beginning to want to understand as a person, rather than just a variable. He told her about a man named Andrzej, a librarian in Pilsen, originally from Poland, who believed that maps were the most honest thing human beings had ever produced. He used to tell Callum, "Show me where a person lives, where they work, where they eat, where they go late at night, and I will show you everything about them that their words will never tell you." She said, "My father used to say something similar. He said, 'I know.'" He quoted Andrzej often. They were friends, toward the end. She said, "You and my father went back a long way." He said, 15 years. He found me after my brother disappeared. He was the only person outside my network who knew to come to me. She said, "Why did he come to you?" The pause was long enough to mean the answer mattered. He said, "He told me he had been watching me work for years. He said I was the only person he had seen who mapped people to protect them rather than to use them." She said, "Was that true?" He said, "It used to be cleaner than it is now." He said it without self-pity, without excuse, as a statement of a complicated fact. "I started out protecting people, then I became something people needed protecting from. And your father kept mapping me even after that. I never understood why," she said, "because he thought you could come back." He looked at her, and she could see, clearly, that she had said something he had not prepared for. Then a message came in, and he was on his feet before she had registered the shift. 3 phone calls in succession, quiet and precise. Someone in his network had been exposed. He moved through the room giving instructions in the particular manner she had come to recognize. No raised voice, no wasted words, moving only as much as necessary. A controlled response to a moving situation. In the middle of the 3rd call, he looked across the room at her, not checking if she was safe. Something else. She was the fixed point in the room, the calibration. When it was resolved, he stood at the window looking out at the city. She went to stand beside him. She said, "You have been doing this alone for 11 years. He said, "Alone is easier. Decisions are faster." She said, "But..." He turned slightly. He said, "But tonight I looked up and you were in the room, and something in the decision became clearer." She said, "I think I know what my father was trying to say, not just with the map, to me specifically." He said, "Tell me." She said, he was saying, "This is the world, do not look away from it, and do not face it alone." The distance between them changed, not because either of them moved, because both of them stopped pretending it was wider than it was. He placed his hand over hers, slowly, the way a person sets something fragile down without sound. She did not pull back. They stood at the window for a while, hand in hand. Chicago 14 floors below them, lit up and indifferent and brilliant. She thought, "I have been careful for 8 months. Careful about everything. Careful every single day. And right now I am not being careful at all." She found to her own surprise that she was all right with that. She did not know then that this was the last good day of that particular season. Marcus Webb had been her father's colleague in the early years, before Edmund began working with Callum. She had heard his name once or twice in childhood, attached to stories about her father's professional past. On the map, he appeared as a secondary node, not yet fully decoded. His message arrived the morning after the window scene. He wanted to meet, without Callum. He said there were things she needed to hear before she went any further. The park was 6 blocks from the Institute. November bare, the trees stripped down to their architecture. He was already on the bench when she arrived, an older man, 64 or so, with careful eyes and a slight tremor in his hands that she did not think was from cold. He had been carrying something heavy for a long time. It showed. He told her. Callum Reyes knew Edmund was in danger, not as a suspicion, as specific intelligence. 1 week before Edmund died, Callum received information that someone in his network was going to be targeted. He did not warn Edmund. Edmund was not on the protection list Callum activated. Nora sat with that. Let it settle. Said, "Why not?" Webb did not answer fast enough. She said, "You are either telling me the truth, or you are the one who killed him. Which is it?" He said, "It is not that simple." She said, "Yes, it is." She stood up. She walked away. She did not say anything else to Marcus Webb. She walked 12 blocks to Callum's building, did not call ahead, did not stop at the front desk. Phil opened the elevator for her. His face told her he knew something was wrong and had decided the right thing was to stay out of it. Callum was at his desk. He looked up when she walked in. He read her face the way he read everything, and she watched him understand. in the space of 1 second, what she had come to ask. She said, "Did you know someone was going to come for my father? In the week before he died?" He did not answer immediately. That pause, 3 seconds at most, but it was the answer. She said, "Tell me." He stood, squared up. He said, "I received a warning, general in nature, not targeted. An indication that someone in my network was going to be approached or threatened. I activated protection for 3 people whose exposure level I assessed as highest. Your father was not on that list because my intelligence indicated that I was the primary target." She said, "But he died." "Not you." He said, "Yes." She said, "And you have known this for 8 months." He said, "Yes." She said, "You let me spend a week in this room, reading his maps, telling you things I have never told anyone, and the entire time you knew that you might have been able to save him." He said, "I did not know." She said, "You knew enough to wonder, and you did not tell me." He did not argue. He did not reach for an excuse. He said the true version, which was worse than any excuse because it could not be argued with. He said, "I was afraid that if you knew, you would stop, and I needed you to finish decoding the map." She looked at him for a long moment. She said, "At least that is honest." Before either of them could say anything further, one of his people came through the door. Senator Mast had made a move. He was trying to reach Jake in Boston. Not this weekend. Tonight. Callum was on the phone before she had processed the sentence. 7 minutes. His voice was precise and low, and she watched him coordinate 3 different elements simultaneously, without losing composure and without slowing down. He secured Jake without anyone in Boston understanding why a discreet security detail had suddenly materialized in the vicinity of a graduate engineering student. Jake was safe. She picked up her coat. He said, "Nora." She said, "Jake is safe. That is what matters right now." He said, "I should have told you." She said, "Yes." She was at the door. She did not turn around. She said, "The map is decoded. You have everything you need to finish what he started. You do not need me anymore." He said, "That is not—" She said, "Good night, Callum," and she walked out. She did not take a cab. She walked. She needed the cold air and the movement. She was 4 blocks from her apartment when they came out of the side street. 2 men, professional, fast. One had her against the wall before she understood what was happening. The other stood close and said, "The map. Everything you have on you. Right now." She did not have the map. She had learned from the first morning never to carry it unless she was going somewhere specific with it. She said, "I do not have it." The one holding her said, "Wrong answer." He hit her once. Not hard enough to do serious damage, hard enough to make a point. She felt the impact across her cheekbone. Her lip split where it caught her teeth. She went down to one knee on the cold pavement. They heard footsteps in the alley before she did. One of them said something to the other, and they moved fast, and they were gone. She was still on one knee when Callum's person came around the corner. A man she recognized from the office. He had been there the whole time, she understood. Callum had put surveillance on her without asking her, probably from the first day, because that was simply what Callum did with people he considered himself responsible for. The man helped her up. He called someone. She did not have to guess who. She sat in the back of a car and pressed the inside of her wrist against her lip and thought about her father's map and about the name Harlan Mast and about what it meant that someone had felt threatened enough by a 28-year-old archive specialist to put 2 professionals in an alley. She thought about what it meant that Callum had known all along and said nothing. She thought about both of those things for a long time. The car stopped at a building she did not recognize. Not Callum's office. A safe house. Inside was warm and quiet. She was given ice in a cloth and left alone in a kitchen. Then the door opened and Callum walked in. He stopped in the doorway. He looked at her face, at the bruise beginning along her cheekbone, at the split in her lip, at the way she was holding the cloth, her hands steady, but her fingers clenched just a little too hard. She watched something happen to him that she had not seen before. Not loud anger, not the kind that breaks things or raises voices. Something colder. Something that began in his eyes and moved outward with complete deliberateness, the way a temperature drops in the minutes before a storm. He crossed the kitchen to her. He crouched down so that he was at her eye level. He took the cloth gently from her hand and looked at the damage. His face was still. His face was always still, but something underneath it was not. Then he asked, in a voice so quiet she had to lean slightly forward to hear it. Who had the nerve to hit you? Not what did they look like? Not are you all right? Not what happened? Who had the nerve? She looked at him and understood that 11 years of iron discipline had just cracked in a kitchen in a Chicago safe house over a bruise on her face and a split lip. He was not going to throw anything. He was not going to shout. It was so much more controlled than that, and so much more dangerous. She said, "Masts, people." He set the cloth down. He stood up. He made 3 phone calls. The first was to Marcus Webb. He said, "You came to her with information about the warning I received before Edmund died. I need to know where you got that." Webb said after a pause, "Mast. He approached me 2 weeks ago. He wanted me to make her doubt you so she would stop working." Callum said, "And you did it." Webb said, "I was afraid." Callum said, "I know. Thank you for telling me the truth." He said it without judgment, flat as a statement of fact. Then he ended the call. The second call was to a woman named Diane Park, investigative reporter, 15 years covering political finance at an independent paper. He spoke with her for 4 minutes. She asked 3 questions. He answered them. When he was done, she said, "How long do I have?" He said, 48 hours before anyone else gets confirmation." She said, "I need 36." He said, "You have them." The third call was to a federal prosecutor named James Ortega. He had been holding a specific piece of information for Ortega for 3 years. He said, "The time is now. I am sending everything tonight. I need you to open before the end of the week." Ortega said, "How complete is the evidence package?" Callum said, 20 years of documentation from the most meticulous source in Chicago. Cross-referenced, date-stamped, and in a form a jury can follow. You will not have a cleaner case this decade." Ortega said, "I will have my team ready." Then Callum sat down at the kitchen table across from Nora. She had been watching him make the calls, sitting very still, the cloth pressed to her lip. He said, "I am going to use all of it. Tonight. Everything your father built. I am not going to wait for the right moment or deploy it strategically in pieces. I am going to open every window at once." She said, "That was not the plan." He said, "The plan was made before tonight." She said, "This exposes you too." He said, "I know." She said, "You know, and you are doing it anyway." He did not answer that. He looked at her face and she understood. Yes, he was doing it anyway. She did not say anything else that night. She let him arrange for someone to take her home. She slept 5 hours. She had not slept 5 consecutive hours in 8 months. At 6 in the morning, she turned on the news. Diane Park's story was the lead. By 9, 3 other outlets had confirmed the financial documentation. By noon, Mast's office had released a defensive press statement, which told anyone paying attention that they were frightened. By mid-afternoon, 3 major campaign donors had publicly withdrawn their support. By evening, James Ortega's office had confirmed an investigation was open. She called Callum. She said, "You used everything at once." He said, "Yes." She said, "That was not strategy." He said, "Something changed." She said, "You know this puts you in the frame too." He said, "Yes." She said, "And you did it anyway." He did not answer directly. He said, "I need you to know something. What I said to Mast, when I met with him to make the terms clear, I told him that your father spent 20 years building something that protected people, and that I was in the business of honoring that. That what I expose does not matter as much as what I protect." She was quiet for a moment. She said, "You meant that." He said, "Yes." She said, "That is different from before." She hung up. She sat with her phone in her hand and looked out her window at Chicago in November and thought about her father. He had known this about Callum. He had documented it over 15 years. Not the man who does the right thing when it is convenient. The man who does the right thing when it costs him. That was why her father had arranged for her to find the map. That was why he had built the failsafe the way he had. He had known that when it came down to it, Callum Reyes was the person who would choose correctly when the moment arrived. She needed time. She needed to sit with all of it. The trust that had been broken, and the reason it had been broken, and what the man had just done on her behalf, and what her father had believed about him for 15 years. She needed to figure out what she believed. She took 7 days. She did not go to his office. She did not call. But she did not stop moving. From her apartment, using what she had decoded from her father's map, she traced the 7 evidence locations on her own. Not to retrieve them, to understand the complete architecture before she decided anything, to see the whole thing her father had built the way he would have wanted her to see it, from above, with full context before committing to a direction. And in the process of that, she read everything her father had left through a lens she had not had before. Her father had known about Callum completely, not in outline, in full. Every decision, every compromise, every place where the work had become something darker than it started as. Edmund Voss had documented all of it with the same precision he documented everything else. He had seen Callum clearly, which meant he had seen the failure that had cost Edmund his life clearly too. And he had still arranged for Nora to find the map, had still designed the failsafe to lead her to Callum, had still written Callum's name in the note beside hers and Jake's as one of the people worth protecting. This was not her father forgiving Callum on her behalf. Her father was gone. He could not do that. This was something different. This was her father saying, "I saw this man whole. I understood what he was and what he had done, and I still believed he was the right person to stand beside my daughter when I could not." That judgment deserved serious consideration. Jake called on day 4. He knew something had happened. Not from the news. From the way she had been answering the phone all month. She told him the truth. Not all of it. Enough. Their father had done important and dangerous work for a long time because he believed it was right and necessary. He had loved them both in every way he knew how, and he had left something for her to finish. Jake was quiet for a moment. She could hear him thinking, the particular quality of silence that meant he was doing the thing their father had also done, which was take a thing apart carefully before saying anything about it. He said, "Did he trust you enough to think you could actually do it?" She said, "Yes." Jake said, "Then do it, Nora. That is what he is telling you. That is the whole message." She sat with the phone after the call ended. Her 22-year-old brother, the person she had been trying to shield from all of this, had just told her something she needed to hear. She had underestimated him in the same way her father had underestimated her. The Voss family had a pattern, and she was beginning to see it from both ends. Meanwhile, across the city, Callum was not looking for her. He had given Marcus Webb a second meeting, this time to listen rather than ask. Webb was not a good man or a bad one. He was a man who had spent years choosing not to know things because knowing them would have required action. He had told Nora about the warning because Mast had told him to, and he had done it because he was afraid. He was still afraid. But he was also tired of being afraid, which sometimes produces honesty in people who have been honest with themselves about it. Webb said, "Edmund did not just trust Callum with the work. He trusted him with Nora. Those are not the same thing. The first is professional, the second is personal. The second is telling you what mattered most to him." Callum said, "I failed him." Webb said, "Once. Then you spent 8 months not failing everyone else." It was not absolution. It was a fact, accurately stated. It was the kind of thing that does not make you feel better but clarifies the path forward. Callum went back to his office. He opened a file on his computer, the first new file he had opened in 11 years with the specific intention of building a profile. He typed the name, Nora Voss. He looked at the blank document for 30 seconds. Then he closed it. Did not delete it. Did not fill it in. Closed it and left it empty and chose, for the first time in a very long time, not to know everything in advance. Some things, he was beginning to understand, were better not mapped. On day 7, Nora put on her coat. She did not call ahead. Phil was at his desk when she came through the front door of the building. He looked at her face, which had mostly healed over the past week, and he opened the elevator without a word. He had the particular wisdom of someone who has watched a lot of things unfold and knows when his role is to simply step aside. Callum was at his desk reading. He set the book down when she walked in. Slowly. The way you put down something you want to be careful with. She said, I have 2 conditions. He waited. She said first, any information that affects my safety or Jake's, you tell me immediately. Not after you have calculated whether it serves the larger goal. Immediately. He said, agreed. She said, second, when this is finished, I want to know everything. Not a summary, all of it. I will decide what to do with it. He said, that is not a simple ask. She said, I know it is not. It is what I need. A pause. He said, agreed. She said, I am not telling you I have forgiven you. He said, I am not asking you to. She said, I am telling you I understand why you made the choice you made. And I think you were wrong. And I think you know you were wrong. He said, yes. She said, that is enough to move forward. She put her coat on the back of her usual chair. She said, show me where we are. They worked differently now. There was a careful distance between them, deliberate and honest, the kind that belongs to people who are rebuilding something and have decided not to rush the process. But they were also more direct with each other. The performance of normalcy that people maintain in the early stages of working relationships was gone. They had moved past that and come out the other side. He asked for her opinion on a decision that had nothing to do with the map, how to approach a witness connected to one of the evidence locations. He had far more experience in this area than she did. He did not need her input. But he asked, and when she gave it, he adjusted his plan based on what she said. She watched him do it and understood that he was not doing it out of courtesy or to build goodwill. He was doing it because he had decided her judgment was worth incorporating. She noticed the book on the corner of his desk. History of Cartographic Practice in Chicago, 1890 through 1950. Her father's era. His subject. She had not seen that book there before. She said nothing about it. But something settled in her, some resistant thing that had been braced for the past week, and let go. Over the next 4 days they gathered the evidence. 6 of the 7 pieces were in Illinois, and they moved through them systematically, sometimes together, sometimes with Nora going in alone because she could read the specific location instructions her father had encoded, and Callum could not, sometimes with Callum coordinating from the office while she worked in the field. They developed a rhythm for it. Brief, efficient communication, no wasted words. The Boston piece came from Jake. She had called him and told him where to look and what to look for. Jake found it in 2 hours. He packaged it the way their father had taught both of them to package anything sensitive, sealed so that the wrong person opening it would leave a mark. He sent it by courier, not mail. He called her when it was in transit. He said, I want to come to Chicago this weekend. She said, yes, come. He said, I want to meet him. She paused for just a moment. Then she said, I know. When all 7 pieces were assembled on the work table, the full picture was something that stopped them both. What Edmund Voss had built over 20 years was not a targeted case against a single corrupt politician. It was a complete record of how power actually moved in Chicago. Political influence and criminal infrastructure woven together through city contracts, development financing, and campaign money. Documented with the precision of a man who had spent his entire adult life learning how to make information permanent and verifiable. Not a weapon to destroy one person. A historical document with the power to change how accountability worked if it reached the right hands. Callum said, "He didn't build this to burn mass down." She said, "No, he built it to make sure it couldn't be buried." Callum said, "He wanted it in the archive." She said, "He wanted it where I work, where it would be properly kept, where someone who understood both the coding and the historical context could make sure it was accessible to the right person at the right time." She looked at him. He was looking at the 7 assembled folders on the table, and she could see him understanding, fully and completely, that Edmund Voss had designed all of this from the beginning. The archive where his daughter worked, the daughter who understood his language, and the institution's systems both, the man he trusted to protect her, the moment when the evidence would be needed and someone would know how to use it. Her father had been a cartographer in every sense of the word. He had mapped this outcome 15 years before it happened. Callum met with Mast alone. A conference room in a hotel downtown. Morning light. He brought one folder. He sat across from the senator and placed the folder on the table between them and said, "This is a summary of 18 years of documentation regarding your financial and political activities. The original materials are being placed in a historical archive, sealed for 25 years. After that, the record will be available for whatever purpose it serves at that time," Mast said. "And if I move against any of the people involved," Callum said, "it goes out tomorrow, all of it. To the reporter who already has the preliminary story, to the federal prosecutor who has already opened an investigation, and to every major donor you have left." Mast said, "You would expose yourself." Callum said, "Edmund Voss spent 20 years building something that protected people. I am in the business of honoring what he built. What I expose does not matter as much as what I protect." Mast looked at him for a long time. Then he stood up and left. That evening, Callum came to the archive. He brought coffee. No phone call ahead of time. Nora was at her station finishing the last of the cataloging, the final stage of integrating her father's documentation into the Hargrove Institute's collection, in a form that would survive institutional changes and personnel turnover, and the particular kind of forgetting that organizations practice on things they no longer actively need. She looked up when he walked in. She said, "It is done?" He said, "Mast will not move. The materials are secure." She said, "And you?" He told her what he had said in the hotel conference room. She listened to all of it. Then she said, "You meant every word of that?" He said, "Yes." She said, "That is different from who you were 2 weeks ago." He said, "I know." She stood up. She went to a specific section of the archive shelving, a range she had reserved under her own employee identification number. She retrieved a small box sealed with blue tape. She brought it to the work table and set it in front of him. She said, "My father left one more thing. Not in the map, not in the note. Cataloged here, in this specific location, under my employee number, flagged for my attention. I found it 5 days ago." He said, "What is it?" She said, "His journals. 20 years of them. Everything he thought and observed and recorded that he did not code into the maps. The private version of the record." She slid the box toward him. "He indexed it for you. Your access, not mine. He knew you would be here." Callum looked at the box, then at her, then back at the box. She watched something move through him that she could not fully name. Not grief exactly. Something that contained grief but was larger than it. Recognition, perhaps. The particular feeling of being seen by someone who is no longer there to receive the acknowledgement. He said, "He mapped everything, didn't he?" She said, "Everything he thought was worth keeping." They stood at the table for a moment, in the particular quiet of people who have been through something real together and come out the other side, not unscathed, but intact. Then he said, "Nora, when this is all behind us, what do you want?" She thought about it honestly. She said, "I want to keep doing what I do, reading records, finding the patterns, understanding what people leave behind, and making sure it is not lost." He said, "And me?" She looked at him. She said, "I want to stop knowing everything in advance," he said. I want to start from not knowing what comes next and find out. She said, That sounds genuinely frightening to you. He said, Yes. She said, There is a research consultation opening at the Institute, someone who can read patterns in historical records and connect them to contemporary behavior. The pay is not good. He said, I do not need the money. She said, I know. He said, Are you offering me a position, Miss Voss? She said, I am offering you a reason to show up somewhere every day, where someone will notice if you don't. He moved toward her, slowly, without suddenness, the way he did everything. He put his hand against her face the way she read her father's maps, with his fingertips, gently, reading what was real. She did not move away. He said, I will show up. 6 months later, Chicago in May. The lake was a deep blue-green, and the city smelled like rain and new leaves and everything that comes after a long winter. The archive in the afternoon was a different place than the archive at night. Warm light came through the high windows. Dust moved slowly in the air, fine as powder. It smelled the way Nora's earliest memories smelled, the particular combination of old paper and cotton thread and wood that she had always associated with things being properly kept. There were 2 desks in her workspace now. Hers, with the slight controlled disorder of someone who thinks spatially, who needs to see all the relevant materials at once. The other one, near the window, with a notebook and a pen, and the kind of careful organization she recognized from the filing cabinets on the 14th floor of a building in the West Loop. Callum came 3 afternoons a week. He did not have an official title at the Hargrove Institute, which suited everyone. What he had was a long-term research project he was conducting in collaboration with the archive's lead specialist, a collected history of how Chicago had navigated periods of concentrated power from its reconstruction after the 1871 fire through the present day. The project had academic partners, a preliminary publication agreement with a university press, and the meticulous sourcing standards of someone who had spent his professional life understanding how information could be used. Edmund Voss had started this work without knowing he was starting it. They were finishing it together. Jake came for the weekend in late May. He had accepted a position with an engineering firm with offices in the Loop, starting in September. He was staying with Nora while he looked for an apartment. He had a specific list of neighborhoods he was considering, and a very specific reason for wanting to be in Chicago that had nothing to do with the job market. He met Callum on the Saturday afternoon in the archive. Callum was at the window desk reading one of Edmund's journals, taking notes in his small, precise handwriting. Jake stood in the doorway for a moment, reading the room the way people do when they are entering a situation they want to understand before they participate in it. He was his father's son in that respect. He watched the way Nora put a folder on the edge of Callum's desk without interrupting him. Watched the way Callum picked it up without breaking his reading, looked at it, set it in his working stack. Watched the absence of announcement in everything they did, the way 2 people occupy the same space when they have stopped navigating each other and started simply existing alongside. Later, outside on the steps, Jake said, He is pretty intense. Nora said, He is pretty much everything. Jake thought about that for a moment. Then he said, Dad would have liked him. I think Dad did like him, actually. Nora looked at the street, at the people moving along the sidewalk, going wherever they were going on a Saturday in May, their lives full of whatever they were full of. She thought about her father cataloging the world for 20 years, building something meant to outlast him. She thought about the journal in that small box sealed with blue tape, the private record of what a careful man had thought and felt and believed over 2 decades, addressed in the end to someone he had trusted even when trust was complicated. She said, I think you are right. Phil retired in June. There was a small gathering in the lobby on his last day, cake and coffee, and a lot of people telling a lot of stories about things he had done over 15 years that they had not known to credit him with at the time. He had been quietly holding this building together for longer than most of the current staff had worked there. He shook hands with Callum at the door on his way out. Not the particular deferential nod of someone acknowledging power, a handshake between two people who understood each other. He said something too quiet for Nora to hear from where she was standing. Callum listened, nodded once, and held the door for him. She watched that and understood something that would have been harder to put into words. Phil had known what Callum was before any of this began. He had known for a long time, and he had greeted him as a neighbor anyway, because he had also known what Callum had chosen to be, and that had mattered more. On a Wednesday evening in late June, Nora closed the archive alone. Callum had a meeting downtown that had run late and was going to meet her for dinner. She turned off the reading room lights, the reference desk lights, the corridor lights in sequence the way she always did, moving through the space by memory as the familiar dark settled around her. At the last switch, she paused. 34,000 documents behind her in the dark. Her father's maps on the restricted shelf, properly catalogued, properly preserved, accessible to the right researchers, with the right credentials and the right reasons. His journals in a sealed section under Callum's access code. 20 years of careful, necessary work, kept the way it deserved to be kept. She turned off the final light. She walked through the dark toward the door, knowing the path without needing to see it, and pushed through into the lit hallway. Callum was already there. He had gotten away from the meeting earlier than expected. He had her coat over one arm. He handed it to her without comment, the way people who know each other's habits handle small things, without ceremony, without needing to announce the care behind the action. She put the coat on. They walked out together into the June evening, the city warm and loud and full of the particular energy that Chicago produces when winter has finally, genuinely, released it. She thought about her father, about the maps he had drawn and the language he had built, and the long game he had played over 20 years, protecting people by documenting them, believing with the particular faith of a careful man that the right things properly kept would outlast the wrong ones. She was carrying that forward now, with a man who had spent 11 years knowing everything about everyone and was learning, slowly and with some difficulty, that the most important things could not be mapped in advance. That some territory only revealed itself when you were already inside it, without a guide, committed to finding your way through. The archive held 34,000 documents. It held her father's work. It held, in a sealed section with restricted access, everything Callum Reyes had done and survived and chosen and lost across a long and complicated life. And it held, catalogued nowhere, filed under nothing, the particular quiet that settles into a room when two people have stopped performing for each other and started simply being. Her father had spent his life recording what was worth protecting. She understood now that this, too, was worth protecting. This, too, was the cartographer's daughter's work. This work is a creation of the author's imagination, designed to entertain and provoke thought. Any resemblance to real persons, places, or events is purely accidental. The author assumes no responsibility for interpretations that connect fictional elements to real-world entities.
Before we close this story, I want to sit with you for just a moment, because this was never really about a corrupt senator. It was never about hidden evidence or underground networks or the cold machinery of power in a winter city. This was a story about what people leave behind and what we choose to carry forward. Edmund Voss spent 20 years documenting the world around him, not for fame, not for money, because he believed, down to the bone, that the truth properly kept, carefully preserved, would outlast the people who wanted it buried. He was a quiet man, doing invisible work, and when he understood that his time was running out, he did not panic. He did not destroy everything to protect himself. He made one final decision. He chose his daughter. That is the first lesson. The most powerful thing you can give someone is not money, not connections, not a name. It is your belief in them. Edmund did not tell Nora she was ready. He showed her by trusting her with the most important thing he had ever built. Real love does not always announce itself. Sometimes it looks like a map left in a donation box. Sometimes it looks like a bedtime story with hidden coordinates. Sometimes the person who believed in you most never got the chance to tell you directly, but they showed you anyway. Pay attention to how people showed you. The second lesson belongs to Callum. Here is a man who spent 11 years knowing everything about everyone, and it still was not enough to save the person who mattered. His greatest strength became his greatest blindness. He confused information with protection. He confused knowing with caring. And when Nora walked out that door, he finally understood the difference. The most dangerous thing is not ignorance. It is certainty. The man who thinks he has mapped everything stops looking. And that is exactly when the territory shifts beneath him. The third lesson is about trust after betrayal. Nora did not forgive Callum because he apologized. She did not go back because she needed him. She went back because she examined the evidence the way her father had taught her, and she made a clear-eyed decision. That is what strength actually looks like, not the absence of hurt. The ability to hold the hurt clearly, understand its shape, and then choose what to do next. Forgiveness is not weakness. Forgiveness, on your own terms, with your eyes open, is one of the most powerful decisions a person can make. And the final lesson, the one that runs underneath all the others. What you protect matters more than what you expose. Callum said it himself, sitting across from a man who had orchestrated a murder and called himself a public servant. He said, "What I expose does not matter as much as what I protect." That sentence is worth keeping. In a world that rewards the loudest voice, the sharpest attack, the fastest strike, there is a different kind of power available to people who are willing to be patient, careful, and honest about what they are actually fighting for. Edmund Voss knew it. He spent 20 years proving it. Now you know it too.